"Don't touch me," she hissed, the words barely a whisper, yet sharp enough to slice through the quiet of the hallway. My hand, hovering just inches from her shoulder, froze. I'd been reaching out, a stupid, impulsive gesture meant to comfort, or maybe something more, I wasn't even sure. But her reaction, the venom in her voice, stopped me cold. She didn't turn. Her back was to me, rigid, the thin cotton of her summer dress doing little to conceal the tension radiating from her. The moonlight spilling through the upstairs window painted her in stark contrasts, highlighting the delicate curve of her neck, the way her dark hair tumbled down her back. Beautiful. And completely untouchable. I wasn't going to, I started, the words stumbling out, already sounding weak even to my own ears. "You weren't going to what exactly, Ethan?" Her voice was low, dangerous. She finally turned, her eyes catching the moonlight, flashing like polished obsidian. "Were you going to try and apologize again? For what happened at the lake?" The lake. Just the mention of it sent a shiver down my spine. A week ago, a lifetime ago, everything had changed there. One stolen moment, one shared breath, and the carefully constructed walls between us had crumbled. "It was an accident," I mumbled, knowing how lame it sounded even as I said it. Accidents didn't usually leave you breathless, craving more. "Some accidents have consequences, Ethan." She took a step closer, the air between us crackling with unspoken words. "Consequences we can't afford." Her name is Isabella, but everyone calls her Izzy. She's my stepsister, which on paper makes us family. In reality, it makes us something else entirely. Something complicated. Something forbidden. We've lived in the same house for 5 years. Ever since my dad married her mom. 5 years of shared dinners, forced smiles, and an undercurrent of tension that hums beneath the surface of every interaction. 5 years of pretending we don't see each other. Or, more accurately, pretending we don't see through each other. I'm 17, she's 16. I'm supposed to be the older brother, the responsible one. She's supposed to be the quiet, artistic one, lost in her own world. But the roles we play for everyone else are just that, roles. Behind closed doors, in the stolen moments when we think no one's watching, the truth is far more tangled. The house was quiet. My dad and her mom were out of town for the weekend. A rare opportunity for us to be alone. A chance, I'd thought, to finally clear the air after the lake. Now, standing here in the hallway, the air felt thick with unspoken desires and simmering resentment. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was pregnant with the weight of everything we weren't saying. Izzy's eyes searched mine, a flicker of something, vulnerability? Anger? Crossing her face before it was quickly masked. She was a master of control, of keeping her emotions locked away. But I'd seen glimpses, cracks in the facade. And those glimpses were dangerous. "Just go to bed, Ethan," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "And don't touch me again." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of her room. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the echo of her words ringing in my ears. "Don't touch me." The words were a challenge, a dare. And in the quiet, empty house, I knew I wasn't strong enough to resist. The silence in the house was a living thing, pressing down on me, amplifying every creak and groan of the old building. I knew I should go to bed, follow Izzy's instructions. But my feet were glued to the floor, my mind replaying the scene in the hallway, her eyes flashing in the moonlight. "Don't touch me." The words were a brand seared into my brain. I wandered downstairs, the cool tile a welcome contrast to the heat that was building inside me. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the refrigerator light. I grabbed a bottle of water, my hand shaking slightly as I unscrewed the cap. I needed to calm down, to think rationally. But all I could think about was Izzy. I remembered the lake. The way the sun had glinted off the water. The smell of pine needles in the air. We'd been swimming, laughing, the easy camaraderie of childhood friends. Then something shifted. A look, a touch, a shared moment of breathless awareness. I'd reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She'd looked up at me, her eyes wide, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, I thought she was going to kiss me. Then she pulled away, her face a mask of confusion and something else, fear? I'd apologized, stammered out some excuse about it being a reflex. She just nodded, her silence more damning than any words. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a chasm of awkwardness. Now here we were a week later, the tension thicker than ever. I knew I should stay away from her, respect her boundaries. But the pull was too strong. A magnetic force I couldn't resist. I went back upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I stopped outside her door listening. Silence. Was she asleep? Or was she like me, lying awake, replaying the events of the evening? I raised my hand, hovering just above the doorknob. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it was a mistake. But I couldn't stop myself. I turned the knob, the click echoing loudly in the quiet hallway. The door creaked open, revealing Izzy's room. It was bathed in the soft glow of the moon, casting long shadows across the floor. She was lying on her bed, her back to me. Her dark hair was spread across the pillow, her breathing soft and even. She was asleep, or pretending to be. I stepped into the room, my senses heightened. I could smell her perfume, a subtle blend of vanilla and something else, something intoxicating. I moved closer to the bed, my eyes tracing the delicate curve of her spine, the rise and fall of her chest. I reached out, my fingers brushing against her hair. It was soft like silk. She didn't stir. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, the subtle scent of her skin. I wanted to touch her, to run my fingers through her hair, to feel the warmth of her skin against mine. But I knew I couldn't. Not after what she'd said. Don't touch me. I pulled my hand away, my heart aching with a mixture of desire and frustration. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I stood there watching her sleep, mesmerized by her beauty. Suddenly she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open and she looked at me, her gaze locking with mine. For a moment neither of us spoke. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of everything we weren't saying. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Izzy," I replied, my voice hoarse. She didn't move, her eyes still locked on mine. The silence stretched between us, thick with tension. I took a step closer and then another. I could feel the heat radiating from her body, the pull between us growing stronger. "I shouldn't be here," I said, the words a mere whisper. "No," she replied, her voice barely audible. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and touched her cheek. Her skin was warm, soft. She closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. "Don't," she whispered, but the word was barely a protest. I leaned down, my lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative touch, a fleeting moment of contact. But it was enough. A spark ignited between us, a flame that had been smoldering for weeks. She moaned softly, her hand reaching up to touch my face. The kiss deepened, our lips meeting with a desperate hunger. The world around us disappeared, and there was only the two of us, lost in the moment. The rules, the boundaries, the consequences, they all faded away. In that moment, there was only the undeniable truth of our desire. The kiss was like a dam breaking. Weeks of pent-up tension, unspoken desires, and carefully constructed walls crumbled in an instant. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was raw, desperate, acclaiming. My hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, our bodies pressed together. Her breath hitched, a small gasp against my lips, but she didn't pull away. She met my kiss with an equal ferocity, her fingers digging into my shoulders. The world narrowed to the space between us. The moonlight streaming through the window painted us in stark contrasts, highlighting the passion in our embrace. I could feel the rapid beat of her heart against mine, the heat radiating from her skin. The scent of her perfume filled my senses, intoxicating me. I was lost in the moment, consumed by the fire that had ignited between us. We broke apart, gasping for air, our eyes locked. The silence that followed was charged, electric. I could see a mixture of emotions swirling in her eyes: desire, fear, vulnerability. I knew I should say something, apologize, explain, but the words wouldn't come. I was too caught up in the moment, too consumed by the feeling of her lips on mine. I reached out, my fingers tracing the delicate curve of her jaw. She flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Her breath hitched again, and her eyes fluttered closed. "Izzy," I whispered, my voice hoarse. She opened her eyes, her gaze searching mine. "Ethan," she replied, her voice barely audible. I leaned in, my lips brushing against hers again. It was a soft, tentative kiss this time, a question. She responded, her lips parting slightly, inviting me in. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding. Our hands explored each other, tracing the contours of our bodies, rediscovering familiar territory. The world outside the room ceased to exist. There was only the two of us, locked in our embrace, lost in the moment. The rules, the boundaries, the consequences, they were all forgotten. We were consumed by a desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Suddenly, a noise from downstairs shattered the spell. A door slamming followed by voices. My dad and her mom. They were home. Panic seized me. We broke apart, stumbling back from each other. The reality of our situation crashing down on us. Izzy's eyes were wide with fear, her breath coming in ragged gasps. My heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of dread. "They can't see us," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my mind racing. I grabbed her hand, pulling her towards the closet. We squeezed inside, the close confines amplifying the tension between us. We stood there, pressed together in the darkness, listening to the voices downstairs. "We're back," my dad called out. "Honey, we're home," her mom replied. Their voices echoed through the house, each word a hammer blow to my heart. We held our breath, praying they wouldn't come upstairs. The silence in the closet was deafening, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. I could feel Izzy's body trembling against mine. I reached out, my hand covering hers. She squeezed my hand tightly, her nails digging into my skin. I knew she was just as scared as I was. The voices downstairs grew closer. I could hear my dad's footsteps on the stairs. My blood ran cold. He was coming up. We held our breath, our bodies rigid with fear. The closet door seemed to shrink, the darkness closing in on us. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped outside the room. My dad's voice echoed through the door. "Izzy, Ethan, are you two up here?" We didn't answer. We couldn't. We were trapped, caught in a moment of our own making. The consequences of our actions were about to be revealed. The doorknob turned. The door creaked open. My dad stood there, silhouetted against the light from the hallway. He looked at the room, his eyes scanning the space. Then he saw the closet door slightly ajar. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze lingering on the door. I could see the confusion in his eyes. He didn't know what to expect. He reached out and pushed the closet door open. The light from the hallway spilled into the darkness, illuminating us. We stood there, frozen in each other's arms, caught in the act. The look on my dad's face was one of shock, disbelief, and something else, anger? Hurt? I couldn't tell. He didn't say anything. He just stared at us, his eyes burning into us. The silence in the room was thick with tension, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. Then her mom appeared behind him, her face a mask of confusion. She looked at us, her eyes widening in shock. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The moment stretched out, an eternity of silence. The air crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of our transgression. We stood there, exposed, vulnerable, our secret laid bare. The consequences of our actions were about to unfold. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering rage. My dad's face was a mask of disbelief, his eyes burning into me. Her mom stood beside him, her hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Izzy and I stood frozen, locked in our embrace, the remnants of passion clinging to us like a shroud. The first sound to break the silence was a gasp from her mom. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it shattered the fragile equilibrium of the moment. My dad's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He looked from me to Izzy, his gaze lingering on our intertwined hands. What is going on here?" he finally asked, his voice low and dangerous. I couldn't speak. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and guilt. I knew there was no way to explain, no way to justify what had happened. All I could do was stare at my dad, my heart pounding in my chest. Izzy finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "Dad, it's not what it looks like," she said, but even to my ears the words sounded hollow. "Not what it looks like," he repeated, his voice rising. "I walk in here and find you too. Like this. What am I supposed to think?" We were just talking," Izzy stammered, her eyes darting around the room. "Talking?" my dad scoffed. "Is that what you call it?" He gestured towards us, his face contorted with anger. I saw what I saw. "Dad, please," I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse. "It was a mistake. It won't happen again." "A mistake," he thundered. his voice echoing through the room. You think this is something you can just brush under the rug? You think I'm stupid? I flinched at his words, my stomach twisting into knots. I knew I'd crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And now I was facing the consequences. Her mom finally spoke, her voice trembling. John, please, she said, her hand reaching out to touch my dad's arm. Let's talk about this later. No, Sarah, he said, his voice hard. We're going to talk about this now. Right here, right now. He turned back to us, his eyes filled with disappointment and anger. I'm ashamed of you both, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I trusted you. And you betrayed that trust. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a wave of shame wash over me. So intense it was almost physical. I knew I'd let him down, I'd let everyone down. Izzy was silent, her head bowed. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. She was just as ashamed as I was, maybe even more so. Go to your rooms, my dad said, his voice cold. We'll discuss this in the morning. We didn't argue. We didn't even look at each other. We simply nodded and walked out of the room, the weight of our actions pressing down on us. As I walked down the hallway to my room, I could hear my dad and her mom talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out the words, but I could sense the tension in their voices. I knew they were talking about us, about what had happened. I closed the door to my room, the click echoing loudly in the quiet house. I leaned against the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what had happened. One moment of weakness, one stolen kiss, and everything had changed. I looked at my hands, my fingers still tingling from touching Izzy. I could still feel the warmth of her skin against mine, the taste of her lips on mine. The memory of the kiss sent a shiver down my spine. It was a mistake, I knew it was. But a part of me, a dark, forbidden part, didn't regret it. I knew I should feel guilty, ashamed. And I did. But beneath the guilt, beneath the shame, there was something else. A flicker of desire. A lingering echo of the passion that had consumed us. I knew that even after everything that had happened, a part of me still wanted her. I sat down on my bed, my head in my hands. I didn't know what the morning would bring. I didn't know what my dad would say, what he would do. All I knew was that everything had changed. The line had been crossed, the secret was out. And there was no going back. The door to my room creaked open. I looked up, expecting to see my dad. But it was Izzy. She stood there in the doorway, her eyes red and swollen. Can I talk to you? She whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. She stood there for a moment, her back to me, her shoulders shaking. I'm so sorry, she finally said, her voice choked with tears. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I know, I said softly. It's not your fault. She turned to face me, her eyes filled with pain. Yes, it is, she said. I shouldn't have let it happen. It takes two, I said, my voice barely a whisper. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. What are we going to do? She asked. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what we were going to do. All I knew was that we were in this together, whatever the consequences might be. And as scared as I was, as much as I regretted what had happened, a part of me knew that I wouldn't change it. Because in that moment, in the heat of the passion, I had felt something real, something powerful. And even though it was forbidden, even though it was wrong, I knew that I would never forget it. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of what had happened. Izzy and I stood there, facing each other, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. The adrenaline of the moment had faded, leaving behind a raw, exposed vulnerability. What now? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what the future held for us. The consequences of our actions loomed large, casting a long shadow over our heads. Our parents, our family, the fragile balance of our lives. All of it felt precarious, on the verge of collapse. I don't know, I admitted, my voice hoarse. We'll figure it out. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, hope? I couldn't be sure. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from mine. I hesitated for a moment, then took her hand in mine. Her touch was warm, familiar, sending a shiver down my spine. We stood there, hand in hand, the silence between us no longer charged with tension, but with a quiet understanding. We had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. But in doing so, we had forged a connection. a bond that was both dangerous and intoxicating. We knew that what had happened was wrong, that it could have devastating consequences. But we also knew that we couldn't deny the feelings that had brought us to this point. The desire, the longing, the connection. It was all real. As real as the fear that gnawed at us. "We can't tell anyone," Izzy said, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, my heart sinking. "I know. It has to be our secret," she continued, her eyes searching mine. "Can you do that?" "I can try," I replied, but even as I said the words, I knew that keeping this secret would be a burden, a weight that would forever alter the dynamics of our relationship. She squeezed my hand, her nails digging into my skin. "Thank you," she whispered. We stood there for a moment longer. The silence between us filled with unspoken promises and unspoken fears. Then she let go of my hand and turned to leave. "Izzy," I called out. She stopped and looked back at me. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice filled with uncertainty. She shrugged, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "I don't know, Ethan," she said softly. "I just don't know." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the darkness. I sat down on my bed, my head in my hands, the weight of the secret pressing down on me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The morning came, bringing with it a sense of dread. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house coming to life. My dad's footsteps, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the murmur of voices. Everything sounded normal, yet everything was different. I got out of bed and got dressed, my movements slow and deliberate. I knew I had to face them, face the consequences of my actions. But I didn't know what to say, how to explain what had happened. I went downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. My dad and her mom were in the kitchen, sitting at the table, their faces grim. They looked up when I entered, their eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and anger. "Ethan," my dad said, his voice hard. "Sit down." I sat down at the table, my stomach twisting into knots. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken accusations. "We need to talk about last night," my dad finally said, his voice low and dangerous. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the tabletop. I knew what was coming. He proceeded to express his extreme disappointment and anger. He spoke of trust being broken and the inappropriateness of our actions. Her mom echoed his sentiments, though her tone was softer, laced with a hint of sadness. Izzy entered the kitchen. The tension in the room intensified. She sat down next to me, her eyes avoiding mine. The conversation continued, a litany of regret and recriminations. I felt a wave of shame wash over me, so intense it was almost physical. The conversation ended without any clear resolution. My dad said that we needed time to think, time to process what had happened. He said that we would talk about it again later, but he didn't say when. Izzy and I left the kitchen without speaking to each other. We went our separate ways, the weight of our secret pressing down on us. We knew that the events of the previous night had changed everything. Our relationship, our family, our lives. All of it was different now. The future was uncertain, filled with unanswered questions. What would happen next? Would our parents ever forgive us? Would we ever be able to look each other in the eye again without feeling the weight of our transgression? Would the secret that we now share bind us together or tear us apart? I didn't know the answers to these questions. All I knew was that we were bound together by a secret, a forbidden passion that had irrevocably altered the course of our lives. And as scared as I was, as much as I regretted what had happened, a part of me knew that I would never forget the intensity of that moment, the raw, undeniable connection that we had shared. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Our story was far from over.